Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Campanario Yesican honey processed Honduras from Coffee Stopover. And there's the bag right there. And Coffee Stopover, based out of Taichung, Taiwan, and this is their first ever appearance on this channel. They're a coffee roaster I had zero familiarity with going into this review, and actually picked up this bag of coffee at Yuan Coffee while on a trip to Vancouver, as it felt like a great opportunity to review a Taiwanese coffee roaster, having never reviewed any of them before. So when I saw this one, it immediately caught my interest. I'm definitely looking forward to discussing it, as this right here is day 60. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind. Roast profile for this coffee, you can definitely tell that this one is a fair bit more developed than we typically review on this channel, as it's best to say that this one more closely aligns with the medium in terms of that roast profile, as I feel like a lot of people would definitely find this one to have a little bit more development than even they typically do. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 39, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and that's the first note that I took away from this coffee, was that it did have a little bit more development, that roasty, smoky quality, than I might have necessarily reviewed for most coffees. And that's the thing about coffees like this, is it's definitely a wild card going into it. Having zero familiarity, having never heard a single word about this coffee roaster, I didn't really know what to expect from it whatsoever. So when I opened up the bag and I said, okay, this looks probably a little bit more developed than I would normally drink, and then trying it, I'm like, okay, yeah, that's definitely the case, but let's see what we can get from this coffee, as that was definitely the first impression I had, though it did opt for some more traditional Central American components as well, in terms of some nuttiness, chocolate, as well as some very subtle fruit qualities to it. A bit more of these smoky qualities come through in the cool down, but for the most part, I said, there's something to work with here, and we're gonna see what we can get from it. Day 42 opted for the Chemex, and the cup was quite reminiscent of that first impression, with much more of the nutty and chocolatey qualities to it, as well as that smoky and roasty component as well. Fruits a slight bit better defined, as there's some subtle stone fruit that at times can even be reminiscent of a slight peachiness to it. So I'm like, okay, definitely picking up some subtle things from it. Let's move on to day 45, as we opted for the April brewer. And I feel like the best of this coffee definitely comes right off brew, as we were able to pick up some components that at times were reminiscent of what I would describe as being a dense chocolate cake with a notable level of sweetness. However, it does finish into a slightly herbal and nutty component to it as well. There's much more of the roasty qualities as well present within the finish, so there's a little bit more depth to this one, definitely picking out some more things, and that kind of helps, given that I really didn't know anything about this coffee other than the fact that it was a honey processed Honduran coffee. Day 48 through the V60 with lower temperatures, and it felt best right off brew yet again, as it offers more of the traditional Central American profiles to it, but it cooled down into much more of those roasty qualities yet again. That's something that was not necessarily worth the trade-off, as I was losing a fair bit of the, we'll say, subtle fruit qualities in place for, I would say, just a little bit more toned down of a coffee overall. There was a slight bit less of the development smoky qualities to it, but at the same time there was also significantly less of the fruit qualities to it. This time it actually skewed a little bit more on the darker side of those fruits, with a slight grape as well as plum-like attribute. Day 51 opted for the Chemex with the same adjustments, and same thing. The roastiness really seemed to dominate the cup, as the trade-off was definitely not worth it on this day. Some subtle nuttiness can be felt underneath those smoky qualities, but for the most part, neither of those things were the things I was necessarily looking for in this one. Day 54, back through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and this was the best it had been up to this point, as there's much more depth to the cup, and that's the reason I opted for the Chemex, is for whatever reason, just getting a little bit more depth, a little bit more complexity to this coffee, as there's the dark fruits present yet again. So of course, there's grapes, plums, with a little bit of nuttiness, a smokier chocolate. It doesn't necessarily cool off well, and that's the thing I felt about this coffee right from the start, is right off brew, I'm like, okay, I'm picking up a little bit of it, but as I let this coffee cool, a little too herbal, a little too nutty, a little too smoky, a little too roasty for me. Day 57, final notes we have, through the Chemex one more time, and the positive aspects outside of the smokiness are present yet again, with some, we'll say, stronger dark caramel and high percentage cacao chocolate, more consistency to the fruits present in a darker manner, with the best of the coffee coming directly off brew. So definitely feeling that was pretty consistent about this coffee right from the start. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have 3 level 4s, so let's go through those, and we'll start with the chocolate level 4. As mentioned, that's one of the things that was notable. I would actually say definitely right from the start, definitely experiencing a fair bit of that right off brew, and at times I would say it was one of the better defined aspects of this coffee, one of the more pronounced, prominent components of it as well. So level 4 seemed like a really good place to put it. Caramel level 4, I think that maybe that's a slight bit generous. I think it's a little bit more of that kind of caramelized aspect that you can feel with slightly more developed coffees. And it wasn't necessarily an overly sweet caramel. If anything, it was a little bit more of, as I described it, a darker caramel aspect to it. So maybe lower side of level 4, higher side of level 3. Smokiness, level 4. And I feel like that just kind of denotes how much roastiness, how much smokiness there was present within this coffee, especially relative to the vast majority of coffees that we review, as we really don't have a lot of coffees that are on the more developed side of things. So having that score at a level 4 just kind of denotes and demonstrates the profile of this coffee relative to the vast majority of stuff that we do review. Perhaps on the slightly lower side of level 4, but definitely still much more abundant than what we typically have. Handful of level 3s. We'll start with the finish, level 3. So even with it having that, we'll just say lasting herbal and smoky finish to it, it actually finished kind of quick and even. So I think that's the reason why it ended up in that little bit more medium chart at that level 3 mark. Also not something that we typically score with a lot of coffees, as for the most part, they typically score at that level 4. So that part's kind of interesting. Sweetness, level 3. I don't think that this coffee was necessarily meant to be an overly sweet coffee. Even though it is a honey processed coffee, maybe it was going for a little bit more intensity in terms of the traditional Central American profiles to it, but I'm not so sure that sweetness was one of those things it was going for. Florality, level 3, and that was a very subtle floral component to this one, a little bit more of that generic floral sense to it, and I think it was felt underneath so many of the more pronounced qualities to it, which we will discuss here shortly, including the spice, as that scored at that level 3, and that's going to be a little bit more of that kind of allspice, typical Central American quality that you can experience from these coffees, so that was an interesting part to me. Saltiness, level 3, that of course denotes the nutty quality that's present within this one. Berry fruit, level 3, it's one of the things that I'd mentioned quite a bit towards the later days. We'll say that kind of grape-like quality, that darker berry fruit quality to it, as well as that stone fruit scoring there at that level 3. Also those darker fruits, those plum-like attributes to this one. So that kind of takes you through the fruit profiles of this. Bitterness, level 3, that's going to be the coffee bitterness, which is something that I don't necessarily love saying about a coffee, because that's one of the things that I really hope is never experienced in too many coffees. I hope that the profile can be done to an extent where the coffee itself doesn't offer that sort of coffee level of bitterness. Savoriness, level 3. Yeah, there's a savory quality to it. I think that goes in line with the nuttiness of it too. So that's scoring there at that mark. Cleanliness, level 3. And I think I have to be maybe ever so slightly harsh that it's on the lower side of level 3, higher side of level 2. But that's of course going to be kind of hindered by the very strong smoky qualities. To be honest, I didn't necessarily feel the processing of this one. Like, I know that this is a honey processed coffee, but there wasn't any fermentiness, funkiness to it. I feel like oftentimes if you're roasting coffee to this extent, and oftentimes that part of the coffee can be lost in it. So that's why maybe I scored it at the level 3 to kind of say the processing isn't necessarily felt. It's just much more the development of the coffee that's really felt. Final thing worth discussing, actually I think there are 2 things worth discussing. The acidity level 2, that's also very rare. There's not a whole lot of brightness to it, and this could have been a number of factors, as well as the rest of the components of this coffee could have been a number of factors. I didn't get to start this coffee until day 37. It's entirely possible that the best of this coffee was long gone by the time I actually opened this coffee, including any sort of brightness that might have been experienced in this one. That could be why the smokiness is as high as it is, the sweetness is as toned down, the finishes is toned down, and the acidity is as toned down, because we usually don't review coffees outside of their peak window, at least starting outside of their peak window. So that's pretty interesting, and it could have been one of the factors that played into this one. And then final thing worth discussing is the body level 2. I feel like I'm going to attribute that more to the Chemex than anything else. Though I was brewing this coffee in some pretty low doses, given that this was a pretty small size bag to begin with. So that could have been at play, but it didn't necessarily have the amount of body that I was expecting for a Honduran coffee. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. As mentioned early on, it was a little bit of a wild card going into this. I don't have any familiarity with this coffee roaster. I don't have any familiarity with coffee roasters in Taiwan to begin with. So really had no clue what to expect with this one going into it. And I feel like that's often what I'm expecting when I actually do try a coffee roaster that maybe I don't have any familiarity with. A coffee roaster I've never heard anything about. Probably the reason is because maybe they're a little bit more developed in my own preferences, and that turned out to be the case with this one. Though, if I recall correctly, I believe that this one is what they would identify as being on the more medium side of their thing. So it's entirely possible that the rest of their catalog that they list as being lighter might have a little bit different of a profile to it. But just speaking for this one, there are definitely some positives that can be taken away. Obviously, given that this one's a little bit more processed of a coffee and it lacked any of the processing, we'll just say, components that aren't necessarily my favorites, that was a nice bonus to this one. But outside of that, I'm still going to give it a little bit of leeway. I don't think I don't think a lot of the techniques I have are designed for a coffee like this. And in addition to that, I feel like perhaps the best of this coffee was long behind it given the time frame we were actually able to start this one. So definitely not my type of coffee, but I found some interesting notes to kind of discuss on this one. It's also a nice change of pace to discuss something that is a little bit more developed, a little bit more outside of my comfort zone as opposed to the very light coffees that we usually do discuss. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. Very straightforward, easy to recommend suggestion. Anybody that does like their much more traditional Central American profiles, this one offered all of those qualities, that coffee-like attribute to it. And while it may have been lacking a little bit of body, it's the chocolate caramelized aspect to it. And in addition to that, a toned down brightness is, again, for people that typically seek these coffees, it's because they can't handle too much of the acidity, the brightness. And I feel like that kind of was at play with this one, as it didn't necessarily offer that essentially at any point in this coffee. So that's the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee or anything from Coffee Stopover, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it or them as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Campanario Yesican honey processed Honduras from Coffee Stopover. Thank you for watching.